So I'm going to start with some introductions and thinking about how we introduce ourselves. I want to talk about why people write and what are the sort of benefits of it. I'd like to share with you research I've done into independent publishing, which is often called self-publishing and sometimes dismissively referred to as vanity publishing. I think there's a huge value in this, and so I want to share my research with you. And then I'd like to move to sort of more proactive things and talk about the satisfactions of writing, and then 5 sort of top tips for getting started. So I suppose the sort of ground rules of what I'm hoping to do is that we should live in the moment and actually be part of this seminar. So please do turn off your phone, don't multitask, do actually give this workshop your attention, because we'll all get more out of it if we're actually listening to each other. And I think do try to sort of think about wider goals rather than what comes next. You know, actually, I'm just been thinking about this at the moment. I'm just reading Michelle Obama's new book, and she had a very good bit of advice in the chapter I read last night about breaking down ambitions into small things rather than just looking at this long-term distant thing that you've got no chance of meeting. And it struck me as very good advice. So live in the moment and be present with us. Okay, so moving forward, I think how we introduce ourselves is a really interesting thing to think about. I think it's a creative decision, and I think you can experiment depending on who you're talking to, how long you're likely to know them for, how well they know you. So, for example, you could talk about your hobbies or your professional role. It's up to you, and really the kind of impression you're seeking to create. So I thought I'd give you an example, which is me. So I'm the elder child of 2. My parents were remarkably unhappily married. It's very mysterious to me how they ever thought it would work, but they've stayed married, and so that's it's meant to be a very useful thing actually to have an unhappy childhood. It's a great asset to a writer. I've always been a massive reader. I think it was an escape zone actually, and I've always read and read and read. I also wrote, I'm ashamed to say that the first book series I wrote when I was 9, quite a few of the books in the series just had paper that was stapled together with a title on the front, and I was meaning to fill in the content later. I did write 2 of them, but so I've always wanted to write. I became a publisher after leaving university. I've got a degree in art history and history together. I married a soldier, which was quite unexpected, really. I don't come from a military family, which I found a lot of people in forces families do. I'd met him at university. I became a publisher, and then after about 4 years in my career, we got married. I'm a mother of 4. I'm an author. I became an academic by accident, because this is a picture of me with my first book, my first published book. My daughter, who's on my lap, was actually the deadline. I finished the book on the Monday and her on the Friday, or gave birth to her on the Friday. So, and then I went on to have 4 children, and each baby had a book as a deadline. And my husband said, we have to find a new source of deadlines. I became an academic because the first book I wrote was reflecting on my career, how to market books, and it became a set book within the new discipline of publishing studies. So I then started writing lots more about how to publish. I then started writing for writers on how to publish, and that's how I became an academic. And I set up the Masters in Publishing course at Kingston University. I've also become a really passionate person about shared reading, as Deborah mentioned. I'm very passionate about the value of reading in any life. It makes people more effective if they're readers. There's so much evidence that they have more joined up brains, more empathetic understanding, reduced likelihood of developing dementia, all sorts of things. So that's how I can introduce myself. But just to show you how you can make the most of any situation, this is somebody I know called Andrew Collins, who, not having had an unhappy childhood, wrote a book about exactly the opposite. So where did it all go right? And it's a wonderfully nostalgic story for anybody who's my sort of age, about growing up in a happy family. So it just shows that any experience can be turned to positive advantage when it comes to writing. I think we must be about the same age, because I remember bungalows like that with it's a new estate because there are no flowers outside. Okay, so I thought it was time just for you to write something about why you decided to, how you would introduce yourself. So imagine that you're introducing yourself to your neighbours, people who are, if you were sitting in a lecture hall, how you might introduce yourself, and also how you might introduce yourself to complete strangers. If you were at a party or sitting on a bus and somebody asked you what you did, what would you offer? So I'm just going to give you 3 minutes to think of something and write it down. I should have asked at the beginning, does everybody have writing materials to hand? Now, you don't have to tell me, but I'm wondering if anybody had flights of fancy of introducing yourself as a complete alter ego on buses, or if somebody asks you and you don't particularly want to tell them, what you might come up with that would be interesting or not interesting. I think it's quite a fruitful thing to think about, how you might introduce yourself, and hopefully giving you all those examples about me has helped you. I tend to offer 2 probably, so I might say I write and I was an army wife, or I teach at a university and I'm very interested in shared reading. So yes, put them in combination. Okay, so I wanted to, Deborah, is there anything interesting in the chat? Has anybody shared anything?
No, no one's shared anything yet. I don't know if this is the recording, but it shouldn't stop people writing in the chat. I was trying to remember, Alison, there's someone who wrote in a book, it was quite a famous book, but it wrote about how he, when anyone asked him what he was, if he wanted to get away, that he would introduce himself as an astronaut when he was a child. Do you know which book that was?
No, I don't know. There's I'm trying to, there's a blues singer now. Who is it? Who the opening line of her autobiography was, my father was 16 when he married. My mother was 13. I was 2. So it was. I mean, it's just such a. I can't remember if I got the ages right, but it was such an arresting start. I've just come back from Mexico, actually. Oh, there's some people in the lobby waiting to come in. I was in Mexico until yesterday morning, and I always like talking to people on planes. And I met somebody whose parents, his mother was Mexican and his father was English, and they'd met at a season at Blackpool when his mother was a member of a circus, a horseback rider, and his father was a trumpeter in the band. I just thought, what a fantastic start, and he was the result. So I just thought, what a brilliant way of introducing yourself.
That's wonderful.
Okay, so something on writing as a process, about why we bother, what it is we're seeking to achieve, and by when we're trying to do it. And these were sort of issues that people often ask about. And my sort of starting point for this evening's was really, this is the longest slide I'm going to show you, that my feeling is that creative writing has become locked in a sort of linear process where the only value that's seen in it as a process is if you have a book published. And I think this is a particularly unhelpful way of thinking about writing, because everybody's writing a book these days, that publishing or publish is now seen as a verb rather than a process. So, you know, everybody can share anything just by pressing the button that says publish. And already publishing a book is seen as, I think it's the 2nd most common New Year's resolution. And it actually beats it, the first being losing weight. So it actually tends to score higher than giving up smoking. So, you know, this is a very common ambition. And I think that can deter people, where they think, well, what's the point? If so many people are writing, why would I bother to add to the pile? And what I want to talk about this evening is why writing is always worth it, and why reflecting on material and ideas that you've got and storing them is always worth it. So that's my sort of starting point. And I was looking for material to sort of confirm this, and started Googling how to publish. And, you know, this is really ridiculously simplistic. This was something I found on the internet, that you identify where you want to publish, you read the guidelines that they offer, you develop a strong query letter, which is, a query letter is a letter that, it's an American term for a letter you send to a publisher saying, wouldn't you like to publish this? And then write the article is number 4. And then build the relationship with editors. I think this is totally spurious and far too simplistic, and sort of delegates the writing bit to number 4, which is, it's just so mechanistic. And I think, so that was a sort of starting point. And then I also found this, which I thought was much more empathetic, that writing is really freeing, because it's the only part of the process where it's just you and the characters, or you and the story, and you're by yourself and you can hash it out. There are no limitations. And I thought that was a really good thing to say, because writing is liberating. And what I wanted to show you, to make that point that writing is liberating is to show you some examples of people who have self-published or independently published a piece of writing which is of immense significance. So this is a self-published book, dictated really. It comes from Glossop, which is near Manchester, and it was a woman who grew up in Houghton Green, which was a colliery town, so it had a coal mine. And this lady died when she was 99, but having never really read or written throughout her life, when she was about 90, she started writing down her life story, and it was all written longhand. And her daughter, who looked after her in her declining years, wrote it all down, typed it up, and had it printed. Now, this is unappealing text. There are no paragraphs in it. It's just every now and again she'll put a sort of gap in the space, but there are no subheadings. The only illustrations, in fact, are these ones that are on the front, which show the Lizzie Barton as a young woman. She was the eldest of 20 children, and Where's Our Lizzie comes from what her mother used to say, which was the family was perennially short of money, and they used to send Lizzie out to do all sorts of odd jobs, like looking after people's children or cooking or doing the ironing. And she was basically a woman for hire. And I'm showing you this because this is a really significant book. As I say, to read, it's very difficult because it's so dense, but it's capturing the memories of a particular time, particular place. It's very concerned with food, because you can imagine if there were 20 children and not much money, what everybody was going to eat to get them filled up was really important. And to celebrate this book, she organised a sort of event in her house, so not many people, and cooked the foods that her mother remembered. So there were things like tater ash, which is mostly potatoes mashed together, but with a bit of corned beef. And she cooked these dishes and hosted this event. The local press covered it because it's a Glossop story and they've got a local newspaper. And what happened then was that because this was a really poor area, a lot of people had migrated or emigrated to Canada and were living in Nova Scotia. That seems to be where they went to. And because it was covered in the local paper in Glossop, that got fed onto a local history website, and it started being bought by people who'd gone to Nova Scotia and wanted to know about where their relatives had come from. So this really unlikely book, which isn't a great pleasure to look at, has become a bestseller. And I just think that it's much better that it exists than doesn't exist, because it connected all sorts of people who come from Glossop to Canada with their history. And it just shows the power of what can be created. I organised a seminar at Kingston actually on self-publishing because I was very interested in knowing more about it, and I was trying to do research into it. Research, I have to say, that was very frowned upon by my academic colleagues who thought it was a terrible thing to be studying. But this is a very romantic story. This is a woman called Janie Watson who came along to this, it was a 2-day training seminar, and she brought with her these books. And what her husband had done was that for a significant birthday, he'd taken her notebooks, had them typeset and had them produced, gave her books in printed form. I just thought, what a beautiful thing to do. So that's self-publishing as a romantic gesture. This next one, again, has huge significance. My mother-in-law comes from Laggan, which is a little tiny village away north of Aviemore in Scotland, and it literally is the end of the valley. The route that goes into Laggan doesn't go any further. And what happened was that to mark the 1914 start of the 2014 start of the anniversary, 100 years of the start of the First World War, the local school teacher, because there's a little school in the village, it isn't a town, took the war memorial and every name on that war memorial and allocated each name to a child in the school. And then the family researched the person he'd allocated. So, they looked up to see whether the person who died was the last in line, whether they had other siblings, whether they had children, and created this particularly important resource for the community. I know about it because my mother-in-law received 3 copies. She hasn't lived in Laggan since she was 18. She left Laggan to go nursing in Perth. But, such was the importance of this book that she was sent 3 copies. And this is profoundly important. It's capturing material that would not be commercially viable. No commercial publisher would take this on because the print run would be too small, but it's a project of immense personal significance, and it will have shaped the experience of everybody who took part in it, particularly the children. Here's another example. This is a soldier who my husband knew, who really, he'd done a lot of research into rifles and kukris, which is a particular knife for kukri, in Delhi in 1857. He didn't think that there was a commercial market for this, but he wanted the story recorded. So he wrote it and self-published it. I hope you're picking up the picture that this is writing that matters. This is the son of a broadcaster called Libby Purvis, who to anybody older than the students will be a very familiar name. She used to be on the Today programme in the morning. Her son very sadly had a period of very difficult mental health and took his own life. And after he had died, they found a whole collection of his writings in his desk. Some of it was, he'd started on a PhD and was finding it very unsatisfying. And he wrote about that. He also wrote theatre reviews and other bits and pieces. And along with his tutor from university, they turned it into a book. So it's book writing as therapy, ensuring a legacy, which is, a very beautiful thing to have done and a very enjoyable thing to do, because they also commissioned the cover because they needed a cover that had a big bit of white space in it. And so they learned about publishing at the same time. And then the final example I'm going to show you is the most homemade, but probably the most precious to me. So because I'd had this idea about how to hold memories that are precious, what I did was I'd done a series of events at the Edinburgh Book Festival. So for my suggestion that year, I wrote to them and said, I'd like to do an event on how to hold memories that matter without formal publishing. And honestly, it was the quickest seminar I've ever advertised, that it sold out really very quickly. And somebody came from New Zealand with this, and I'll just show you what it looks like inside. So that's the back cover. You can see her 60th birthday was coming up, and she printed 60 copies and numbered them and gave me one. So it's full of recipes and pictures of her veranda. And inside she wrote this. Now that's an incredibly precious thing to me, because it's somebody responding to an idea I'd had. I put it out there, and that's Helen. And in fact, I wrote a book on self-publishing and wrote to her and asked her if I could reproduce the story. So that's, I think that's just such a beautiful thing to do. It's poetry, it's pictures, it's recipes, it's gardening tips, and things like that. So that leads me to my question, which is, it's time for you to write something. What is your long-term ambition in terms of writing? What would you like to have done in 2 months, in 6 months? Have a think in a year, or longer. What would you like to have done? Ken, I'll give you a minute and a half to do that. Okay, so I hope that gave you some time to write down some thoughts. Again, you don't have to share them, but be interesting to the chat at the end if anybody wants to. Okay, so moving on. I wanted to share with you the research I've done into self-publishing. Now, I started on this because it seemed to me that self-publishing was the most interesting thing that was happening within the publishing industry, because there was such a lot of it going on. And also it was so universally slammed. And anything that's growing hugely but is so criticised, I think is a very interesting combination. So I started doing some research into it, as I say, very discouraged by those who oversee research because they thought it was a waste of time. So what I found out was that, well, I should say has challenged popular understanding. It's probably a bit much to say it overturned it. But there was this prevailing view that anybody involved in self-publishing was from a specific sector of society and probably pretty poorly educated. That was the assumption. The second assumption was that it's a measure of last resort and delivers no satisfaction. And the third one, which I'd hear quite often, is that the difference between publishing and self-publishing is the presence of an editor. And all of these I found to be not true. The great thing, though, about choosing self-publishing as a topic for research was that there's nobody else working on it. So I didn't have lots of other books to read. And I did do something that genuinely is now in the literature and is now quite accepted. And I've now had PhDs done on what I did. So that's quite interesting. But it does echo work that was done within at the University of Leicester in 1981. That was the only thing I found that had been published on this before. And then I also met somebody at a conference in America who was working on early 18th century self-publishing in the US and found exactly the same things as me. So that was very interesting. So like any academic, I have to tell you what I did. So the first stage was sort of conceptual and experiential. I was talking to people who had self-published. I got quite a good sample. I interviewed 47 people and then also talked to publishers and agents. And I published a book called The Naked Author, with apologies to Jamie. Oh, who do I mean? Cook, Jamie, whatever. And then the second stage was that I started doing detailed quantitative questionnaires with 3 organisations. So the Alliance of Independent Authors, which actually was launched the year my book came out, an organisation called Southeast Authors, and then a publisher that dealt with self-publishing authors. I had a 28% response, which is really high, and I wrote a series of academic papers about this. So just to share the main findings, which I referred to a couple of minutes ago. The first is that self-publishing is undertaken across the demographic spectrum, so all sorts of people are up to it. The people I talked to, there was a predominance of females. Their age was much younger than people imagine, because again, there was this rather dismissive view that it was the untalented elderly who were doing this. And actually what I found, it was the busy, professional, mid-career people who were doing it. 50% were working full-time whilst doing it. So in other words, it was something that really mattered to them. And then they got very high educational attainment. So nearly 44% had a postgraduate degree. So you can see this is absolutely not people who are too stupid to be published traditionally. The second thing was that however I asked the question, now those of you who've done research will know that there can be a temptation to just tick the same box. So if you give people a range of options, they'll just go down the middle and tick. What you have to do is to ask a similar question in different ways, so that actually you're checking out whether they're being truthful. And the fact that these shapes are different shows that they hadn't just gone tick, 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 tick down the middle. They've actually thought about the answers. But the big conclusion here is that people are very happy with self-publishing. No matter how I asked the question, whether it was would they do it again or how happy were they with the product, they were very satisfied. So this is out of 5. So to be getting 4.5 for satisfaction with the product created, it's really significant. It's also significant because it's absolutely not what the traditional industry expected, where there was an assumption that only if you had created something as beautiful as Penguin or Random House would you feel satisfied, whereas in fact people were just satisfied to have completed something. So it was the completion that mattered to them. Self-publishing also doesn't necessarily mean going it alone, which is another common assumption. So what I found was that a lot of the people I was talking to were using the services of an editor or using marketing support, paying for services. And the woman whose picture I've got there is a very interesting example because she really knew her market. She was writing, or is still writing, books about sort of magical realism with sort of interaction between animals and humans. And she used to sell her books through fairs where the sort of fair where new age fairs where you have sort of tarot card readers and people selling henna tattoos and things like that. And all these people are volunteers. So she produces the t-shirt which brands her books, and then people volunteer to come and help sell them. And that's pretty powerful. I mean, it's another way of selling books that doesn't rely on bookshops, but actually meets people where they're keen to spend their money. So that was a very interesting example to me. And this is, she's called Kit Berry, so a nice androgynous name. Nobody knows what gender she is. And the book started out as an email newsletter. She used to email updates on the story. She's got a quote from somebody who's in the same sort of genre who's impressed with her work, and she's doing extremely well. So those are some examples of self-publishing, which I hope will give you confidence to think why it's worth actually storing material. They're not all of them commercially particularly successful. They're not meant to be. My particular definition of self-publishing is it's taking personal responsibility for the storage and the finalization and storage of content. I don't think it has to be about selling. Okay, so I'll pause there just to ask Deborah if there are any comments in the chat, or if I should just carry on.
There aren't yet, but I wonder if anyone has any observations or questions after having heard Alison talk through some of those examples.
Be interesting to know if they rang bells with something anybody else was intending to do.
2 people have got their hands up, so I'm just so brilliant. Jane, do you want to go first? Because I can't find the second hand anyway.
Just on that curation quote that you just said about the finalizing content, one of the things I always think about with writing is it's a way of kind of connecting with other human minds, sort of like sharing it's such a powerful way of us as a sort of a macro organism. Is it also that, would you say, writing, it's a way of kind of connecting with humanity in a way?
And it might be that you connect. It's such an interesting thing to say. It might be that you connect by not telling anybody. It might be that you read something and think, actually, I've had a very similar experience. I'll write it down too. Or it might be that you write it down and share it. But I think it's profoundly human. I think the desire to feel that you've made a mark on the world, that you've experienced something. It doesn't need to be a public something, but the need to finish something, I think, is very important. And what I found through longer interviews with these authors was that it was the completion that mattered, not the format. So it was the fact that they'd finished something that was really important to them. But great comment. Thank you very much, Jane.
Really interesting.
Emma, did you have a question? No? Okay, no, you said I didn't.
Oh, but something I also wanted to say, I really like the idea you're putting out of writing as a way to express yourself and not necessarily to sell it or for people to see it. Because I think oftentimes when we write, we're always trying to get other people to validate it. So am I a good writer?
Exactly.
Does this sound good? And so, yeah, I'm just wondering how you make that mind shift from other people's, like, focusing on what other people think of your writing to, just writing just because. I think I'm finding that difficult. That's a really
interesting question, because I think showing it to other people can be completely the wrong thing to do. That writing is about the individual, not about how other people judge what you've written. And I mean, I was telling Deborah just before we started that one of the things that got me interested in self-publishing was that, I mean, I've been quite open. I've mentioned that my parents had this very explosive relationship, and I was always keen to understand my father, not particularly my mother, because I found her just too difficult, but my father, about why he'd ended up in this situation. And I wrote about it, and I puzzled about it for years, and I wrote about it, not ever intending to share it, but I found the business of sort of sorting those memories and putting them in order, I found it such a healing thing to do. And so it exists, and I could sort of move on with my life rather than sort of wondering about it. So I think sometimes showing things to people too early in the writing process, you can just feel the ideas kind of shrivel as you explain them to people and you see them not moved in the way that you are. So I think it's quite dangerous sometimes to share too early, and you should never as a writer feel judged by what other people say about your writing. If it matters to you and you've done it in the best way you can, that's enough. But I realise it takes confidence to say that. I'm going to move on with what are the satisfactions of writing, because I think it overlaps with that last question, Jane. Shall I carry on?
Deborah? Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay. So I wanted to talk about what are the satisfactions of writing. And then hopefully this will spark thoughts in you as well. I think the first is doing something positive with your time. I think that's massively important. This is a diary. It's a calendar, really. It's extremely old. I don't know if anybody recognises it. It's 32,000 years old. Not that there were dates on the back of it, but that's judging by the rock type and things. It was found in a cave in France, and it's a very basic need to chart time And it's often described as man's earliest calendar, but I think it's probably woman's earliest calendar because it charts 28 days. And who needs to chart 28 days? It also, I think it's really interesting because it looks like a blister pack for oral contraceptives, which I think is quite interesting. But it just struck me as quite a nice illustration for talking about what use you make of your time, how you chart time. This is one of my favourite quotations. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Maya Angelou. If you haven't read her books, you should, because they're heartrending and beautiful. But it's true that the satisfaction of having a story that was in you, out of you, I think is extraordinary. As I say, I found, having done that, I found it brought enormous peace and an ability to sort of stop questioning and just to move on. So I think it can be, to create something that lasts is a really, really important thing to do. Here's another really interesting example. This was a group of writers who got together. They used to have a writing evening once a month. And what they did was publish a story by everybody who was in this group as this self-published book. I just thought it was such a lovely thing to do. So it was a group of 12 people who each put a story in a book. So it's got 12 chapters. It's a fantastic emblem of a group ethic. You know, they are extremely proud of this. They had a launch party, they sold it to their friends, but the most important thing was being in there, being included. So to create something that lasts, I think, is a really important thing to do, to finalize it. It doesn't have to be as shiny as that. I mean, my memoir of my dad is, it's sort of spiral bound. It's very rough and ready, but it exists, you know, it's done, and that's a great thing to do. I think writing can also be reflection, the very act of working on something, making it better, reordering content, deciding where things would better fit, is a really stabilizing thing to do. It brings calm, it brings insight, it brings a sense of completion. So this, as you write, because as you write, you are reflecting, you're reordering, is a really good thing to do. I love this quote from T.S. Eliot from the Four Quartets. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring, we will be to arrive where we started and to know the place for the first time. I don't know if that's familiar to you, but I think it's a great bit of wisdom. And I think when you do start writing, maybe about your life, you can start spotting patterns. You can start spotting heritable things that your parents did that you've also carried on. And it can bring real insight when you start thinking, oh gosh, that's a pattern that I could fall into, and I really don't want to. I think another thing writing does is it reduces the risk of failure. When you start writing and understanding how things have worked in the past, you realize that everything that happens to you is a learning experience. You always learn something. And I'm a great fan of Ken Robinson. I'm going to be quoting from him a little bit later. So I think writing about something and actually analysing how it went and how you could have behaved differently takes the stigma out of failure and actually helps it be a learning experience. And then turning to you as healthcare professionals, I mean, another really good reason for writing is, and this is getting into the publishing area, but you know, people are interested in the lives that healthcare professionals have had. You're surrounded by a quick succession of different characters that you get to know. And these are just the examples I knew of people who've been medics who've then published about the experience. So some of them, these will be known to you, perhaps others not. Henry Miller, his book on Do No Wrong, it's about a brain surgeon and it's all his different cases. Adam Kay, this is a really interesting story, actually. This was a book that I read. He's very well known, but I managed to break my leg really badly about 3 years ago. And I happened to have some copies of the Big Read book in my bag. So when I was taken into casualty with my leg sticking out at a very funny angle, the nurse was talking to me about what I did. And I happened to say, oh, I'm a great enthusiast for people reading. And I gave her a copy of the Big Read because I happened to have one in my bag. And she came in, she popped up in my life about 2 weeks later when I went back to have surgery on my leg. and handed me this book signed by Adam Kay, because I don't know if any of you remember the book he wrote, but it ends with a very dramatic case. And she'd been the emergent ER room nurse that night, and so she knew him and got him a copy. But it just shows how books make friends for you. But Graham Garden, Graham Chapman, Monty Python, the Goodies, these are all very, very famous people who started writing about being medics. So I just thought that might give you inspiration. Jo Brand, it was a psychiatric nurse. And there is a saying that if you keep a diary, it may end up keeping you. That's Richard C. Grant, who's just published, I think, his 3rd volume of memoirs about being an actor. And then Alan Rickman, who was in Harry Potter, who's a very fine actor, again, wrote about what went on. And, you know, these people like to know about the machinations of what's gone on in Hollywood. And so if you write a diary, it may exhaust you, but it may end up keeping you. So a little bit more writing from you now. I want you to spend the same amount of time, give you 90 seconds, about things that you might write about. You know, what is there in your life? Are there any things that have just popped into your radar as I've been talking about things that people have written about that you might think you'd like to write about? So over to you. Please just write things. So I hope that's given you time to have a few thoughts about things you might write about. What I'm hoping is that this session would have been a sort of starting gun or starting point, I should say, for ideas that you'll go away and think about things. And I would say, do use your subconscious. The subconscious can be a great friend to writers. So pay particular attention to what you think of first thing in the morning, because often your brain will be mulling over ideas. Okay, there's a pretty picture for you of people writing things that they can write about.
Before we move on, Alison, I was just going to point out this, because it must have been a little way back, but Sarah mentioned in terms of self-publishing, she reminded us of zines as well, which are...
Yes. Do you want me
I don't know if you want to say anything about it, Sarah.
Yeah.
Could you...
Oh, do, Sarah, yes.
No, no, I just thought it's just, you know, what you were saying, Alison, about people bringing, you know, in volunteers, involving people that are, you know, wearing the t-shirt and helping out the sales and everything. That reminded me very much of the spirit of zines, which are very short run publications, and people, you know, print things in copy machines and with very, very, you know, very little budget. So these are also great ways of circulating creative output. And
Well, if you think back to the 60 Ahead, I mean, that's basically a zine, isn't it?
Exactly,
it's a little publication put together for a 60th birthday party. She asked 60 people, handed out 60 copies. And honestly, it's a really precious thing to me. So yeah, you can invest great quality in things like that. Thank you. Okay, so I wanted to talk about how you might get started. And just to give you some personal thoughts on this, really. That's a nice quote from Walt Disney about the way to get started is to quit talking and start doing. So just a few things. I think it's really important to think about what gets you in the mood for writing. And I would say, think about sports players. And we've got the World Cup going on at the moment, although it's quite compromised by the political situation. But, you know, nobody criticises footballers for having lucky pants or for putting on their socks in a particular order or for seeking to come out of the tunnel in a particular order. And I think writers need to cultivate the things that put you in the mood for writing. This is a picture of the board that's next to my desk where I do my writing. And it's covered with pictures. I love art. I told you I studied art history at university. And if you look at these pictures, there tends to be a lot of pictures that have a really strong white in them. So you can see Whistler there. And I like painting, I like Vermeer very much. And so paintings that have a sort of shiny white that comes through are things that inspire me. So I think surround yourself with things that you like. Have a particular mug that you like that puts you in the right mood. Quite a lot of writers use scents or clothes that help them feel writerly. I interviewed somebody who's a playwright who has special playwright's trousers, which are trousers with lots and lots of pockets and zips. And he says he always puts them on because it makes him feel like he's going to create something great. So cultivate these things and think of the sports people's example. This is the view out of my window first thing in the morning. And what I'm saying here really is work out when your brain works best and use that time for writing. It doesn't have to be a long time. It can just be a very short time. In fact, my best time for writing, I think, goes back to when I had very little children. That I can't help it. I still always wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I used to fight it and think, this is ridiculous. And now I just think, actually, that's my time and I'll get up and use it. And when the children were small, it would be, I'd have the pressure on me that I knew they were going to wake up about 6 o'clock, so I only had an hour. But I think work out when your brain works best and use it for something that's creative rather than just answering emails, which puts your brain in a responding frame of mind rather than a creative frame of mind. So that's 5 o'clock in the morning, looking out over Kingston. Make an appointment with yourself and stick to it. So if you keep meaning to write and you just don't get around to it, pay attention to that because there's an important message there. But, great novels have been written by people turning up half an hour early for work or using their lunchtime or going out to a bench outside the office and just sitting there and writing. And now that more of us are working from home, this is something that can be stuck to. So make an appointment with yourself. And if you keep finding that you can't stick to it, then it may be that writing isn't the thing you should be doing, because if it's too hard, don't bother. Enjoy ways to hold your thoughts. I was actually interviewed, because as I say, I've written about writing a lot, but I was interviewed on Woman's Hour about 5-6 years ago because I was the most stationery obsessed person they could find. And this is my pile of stationery that's too special to use. It's the top shelf in my office. And people, because they know I write, tend to buy me things that they think I'll like, which are quite often writing implements. But for me, my love of stationery was cultivated in French supermarkets, where they usually have a stationery aisle that's full of those beautiful, I think they call them cahiers de devoir, which is a little plan for the week that holds your day's activities with paper with little squares on them. So if that sparks memories in any of you about lovely things to write on, then enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with this. And then also access the creativity of others. Now, this is really the link between open spaces and me, because I find this just listening to things that I don't know anything about really, really interesting. And this is a woman who, one of our students actually at Kingston, who won the 3-minute thesis award. And she's talking about concrete, which may not be a subject that many of you find interesting. But I think what you'll find is her passion is completely captivating. So I'm going to play this to you now. And just see if you find it interesting.
Use material on Earth. We use it for anything, from plant pots to skyscrapers. But concrete is susceptible to corrosion. With time, the steel inside begins to rust. And if the damage isn't spotted in time, the structures may even collapse. This is why, in my PhD, I'm looking at a different material for reinforcement of concrete structures. This material is made by crushing and melting basalt, the most abundant volcanic rock on Earth, and we call it basalt fiber reinforced polymer. Let's just call it rock bar for short. Rock bar is 3 times stronger and more than 3 times lighter than steel, and crucially, it doesn't rust. But it's too flexible, and as it bends, it creates cracks on the concrete surface. For a solution, let's take a look again at my giraffe. When the button is pressed, the giraffe is relaxed and flexible. If we release the button, this tightens a thread inside, compresses the giraffe, and makes it stiff. Surprisingly enough, the same principle applies to reinforced concrete. If we stretch a bar, pour concrete around it, and then wait for it to harden, then release the bar, this compresses the concrete and makes it stiff. We call this pre-stressing. We know that it will make concrete less prone to bending and cracking, but we don't know how stiff it will still be in 50 or 100 years. And this is the question I'm working on in my PhD. The first thing I did was to make a number of beams using the method I've just described. Then I recreate the conditions they will encounter in real life. I observed their behavior over a long period of time using sensors capable of detecting contraction or expansion 100,000 times smaller than a single human hair. This allows me to understand in detail what is changing and why. Using all this data, I'm now developing mathematical models that will allow us to predict how this rock bar reinforced concrete will behave over its entire lifetime. To explain the principles involved, I use the example of a toy. But of course, this is a very serious matter. I believe that replacing steel with rock bar will help engineers build more durable, rust-free concrete structures and so make them less liable to collapse. I'm working on it.
And the final top tip for getting started in writing is just not to think about publication. I think it's really unhelpful to start thinking about what you've written and is it good enough, and it can lead you to seeking feedback at the wrong stage. And actually what one just wants to get on and do is to finish something, because once you've finished something, you can then craft it and work on it to make it better. And as a sort of indication of what I'm talking about, or proof of that, I just thought I'd show you this very unempathetic diagram, which was developed by the business theoretician, marketing theoretician, Kotler. And it's a model of business buying behavior. And his basic concept is that there are all sorts of marketing stimuli about the product you're trying to sell, which meet with other stimuli within the environment, so that there might be an economic difficulty or a political, I mean, all the things we're experiencing at the moment, and that these things impact on the buying organization, which in the case of a bookshop will be the buyer who makes the decision, but the other people he consults. And then these will meet with a range of responses from the people in the market who may decide that they'd rather buy from a different supplier, or they want different order quantities, or they want it now, they want it next week, they want to pay more or less. And these are all the emotions and rational decision-making processes that are going on within the head of those who are deciding whether to buy an author's book. And that might be to buy it for a publishing house, or to buy it for a bookshop, or to buy it for serialization on BBC Radio 4. Now, this is a horrendous amount of things to have to think about at the same time as writing. And that's why I'm recommending that you should think about getting the work to be as good as you can before you think about trying to present it to publishing companies. Now, I wanted to move on now to talk about creativity. How we can, because this is the other important aspect to writing, because when you're writing something, you want to write something that stimulates response from other people, stimulates them to think unusual things. And we can do that best by allowing ourselves to play. Now, I've just given you an example because I'm assuming that for most of you, you haven't really thought about stressed concrete and how to, that really palpable example of how to make the little giraffe stand up straight or wonky by pressing the button underneath. And I just thought I'd give you some examples of creativity. This is one of my favorites, actually. I like listening to Desert Island Discs in the morning as I walk into work. I find listening to other people's choices always makes me feel creative. And I wanted you to think about what makes you feel creative. And when you were creative today, I mean, I've just put up a picture of socks because I think which socks you put on is actually quite a creative decision. You know, you might decide to match the colours that you're wearing, or do you put your socks on first? You know, how do they fit in? And this is a creative decision, as is what to have for breakfast, what to listen to on the radio or the television, if that's what you do in the morning. But to think about what makes you feel creative. So I'm going to give you another screen and ask you to do a little bit more writing. What makes you feel creative, and when were you creative today? I'll give you the same amount of time, so that's a bit more writing. Okay, that's about the same amount of time. But this might be a nice point to share, actually. Has anybody got anything they'd like to volunteer about what makes them feel creative? Sometimes smells can be very creative. New mown hay or new mown lawn is a good one. Is there anything nice in the chat, Deborah?
There's nothing in the chat. I know what stops me from being creative, which is a bit
Right.
the reverse to what you
Yeah.
said. But it's when you've got a to-do list and you're going in a sort of linear way through, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, and your brain is almost having this to-do list in its background, and you know there's no
Yeah.
creative space to think around it. So I always sort of feel more creative when I'm not feeling I should be doing something, but I've almost allowed my head to have some space. Otherwise, I can't make anything. I can't think of anything.
I'm sometimes quite creative with lists. So I'll go through and highlight all the things I absolutely must do today, and then try and give myself a treat at the end of it. So not feel I've got to do everything that day. That can be, or sometimes to put highlighter pens on a list. That makes it feel a bit more sparkly.
That's it. As it's interesting in the chat, Laura, I don't know if you want to say anything about that. You've almost had the opposite of me. You're saying that you get your most abstract ideas when you do have pressure. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure, I don't mind. Yeah, when I'm in sort of high pressure situations, I mean, fortunately, I don't get so stressed by them. And I find that I have my best ideas in terms of how to resolve the situation when I am in those situations. And I mean, ideas that I don't think I would have come up with if I had the luxury of time where I can, wait for the correct tool to come or to do the correct research. Yeah.
I think that's really true. And actually, that was going to be where I finished up. So you've anticipated something I'm going to say in about 4 slides' time. Thank you, Lara.
There's a couple of other comments as well, Alison, actually. Actually, there's several. There's one from Dimitra and one from Omar and Jane as well. Dimitra, do you want to say something about colours?
Hi there. Yes, I always love drawing and painting, and because I can't do that constantly, obviously preparing for work and putting makeup on makes me feel creative every morning.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There was an interview with the very wonderful novelist called Hilary Mantel, who died earlier this year. And gosh, she's such a clever woman. And she did a feature, because newspapers will try and get them to write about something unexpected. And she wrote this piece about the value of makeup to her and how she found it a very calming thing to actually start with a completely a palette, she called it, a blank canvas, and then to build it up in layers. And it was so unexpected, but she wrote about it very persuasively, about it being a calming thing to do. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. A fascinating chat, actually. Omar, do you want to say something? Because I agree with you about in nature and in solitude.
Yeah, so I'm exactly like Deborah. I feel most creative when my brain is off autopilot and all the different things I have to do. When I'm alone, when I'm in nature, when my mind is still. And I also agree that in the mornings, I don't know if it comes from your dreams, but I do feel I have an idea that I want to write down. Of course, I never write it because then I have to go for lectures. So.
But keep a notepad next to the bed. I mean, the great thing is that you recognise that after a time of quiet, an idea pops to the surface. For me, that often used to happen before I broke my leg so badly. I go for a run and I can't think and run at the same time, but I always found that at the end of the run, I would have a good idea. And I didn't know where it came from, but it was just being in tune with your subconscious. And, being outside, you don't have to be somewhere beautiful. If you just walk outside, not implying that St. George's isn't beautiful, but it's quite built up. But, there's that cemetery opposite, isn't there, where, you've got open space there. Just go outside and listen to the birds or listen to the traffic. There's music all over the place.
And put it somewhere in a notebook afterwards, so you don't lose it. James also says something interesting about the constraints that sometimes make you creative. Do you want to expand on that, Jane?
Yeah, I think the most obvious one is, of course, with poetry, if you limit your palette, it can make you really, really creative, because you're not starting with the abundance of anything. You're working within a constraint, and somehow or other that can also happen with other creative things. I think I must say I haven't had the experience of it with writing, because that's not the creative form that I currently go to and that I would like to. I think the Maya Angelou quote was a very powerful one, but I do recognise that poetry constraint approach in other creative things, that when you're limited in your palette, it makes you think really creatively about how to then get that idea or whatever done in that constraining way. I don't know if that resonates.
It certainly resonates with me. Our daughter's getting married in 10 days' time on the 17th of December. And my contribution is I'd offered a grace. I said, I'll write a grace and to deliver before the meal. And I decided that I would do this because I've been very busy on the flight to Mexico. And I wrote, and it really didn't take very long. I just started, and within half an hour I'd written, it's 2 minutes worth of comic verse about her and her partner. But I think because I'd set that deadline and set a format and just wrote down a few ideas I wanted to get across, it really flowed very, very quickly. So that certainly resonated with me. What a lovely thing to think about.
I wonder if there's something about selection being a creative process too, isn't it? But there's a beautiful comment from Natasha, actually. Do you want to say anything about it, Natasha?
Yeah, I guess just like any day-to-day activity that I'm just doing, and then I take a moment to, maybe I've spoken to someone or I've seen someone having a conversation or something, and I'm just let into their perspective of life, and I realize that life is so much bigger than what I'm just living, and it allows me to think about the different avenues that I can explore within my own life and kind of just have that creative outlet.
I'll give you a useful phrase, Natasha, which I use all the time, which is I'll say, I'm doing this for research purposes. And I regard reading Hello magazine, zoning in occasionally to watch I'm a Celebrity, Let Me Out of Here. I didn't do it very often, but I did do it just for research purposes. And you can append that phrase to all sorts of activities, like the need to try out a different sort of coffee or walk a different way to work, or, you know, it's a good thing to do. Definitely. I love that. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm just going to finish off and then we can have a wider discussion, I think. So the most important thing, I think, is just beginning, you know, just making a start, writing something down, purchasing a notebook, buying something you like. And I just thought I'd give you an example from my own life, which is something I've done very recently, and it just shows that it's never too late to do anything. So I heard Deborah introduce me as Reverend Professor. That's really very new. I've only been a Reverend for 2 years. And so 2 years ago, after a lifetime of thinking about this, I finally decided actually I did want to be ordained. So you have to go through quite a lengthy ordination selection process, which is called the discernment process. But, you know, I took myself off to Oxford. I made it through the process. I took a year out of work because there's a sort of fast track process that you can do, that if you've done other things first. And I did have a PhD and I'd got a lifetime on widening participation. So I'd got a degree in history and history of art, which included a lot of church history. So I had various sort of things that got me through a bit quicker. But I did take a year out of work. And in fact, when I did this talk 2 years ago, I was actually in theological college. I went to Oxford, studied there. This was what happened then. That's the person who's the Bishop of Dorking. She ordained me. And then 2 months ago, I married 2 people. So I just thought that was an extraordinary thing to have done at my stage in life. But it just shows that nothing is ever too late. You can always do things. And this was the first couple that I married. I've now done quite a few funerals and 2 weddings. So it just shows nothing is ever off the spectrum of what you might achieve. So I'm just going to recommend a few books that you might want to read. So Dorothea Brand, this book was written in the 1930s, Becoming a Writer, and it's still an absolute classic. I would really recommend it. It's not very long. Julia Cameron wrote a book called The Artist's Way, which she has this series of morning pages, which is about doing a dump every morning of the things that are on your heart, just to write them down. And that's a good thing to do. And then I wrote a book called Is There a Book in You, which is about all the characteristics of writers, which that was a morning book, actually. It was the day after I'd done an event at the Edinburgh Book Festival, which is always such a stimulating time. And I went to bed sort of mulling everything over and woke up with this idea that I could quantify all the things that make you able to write. And I started writing away immediately because my children remember it because they were sharing a room and found it very annoying that I put the bedside light on. But I came up with a list of 10 things you need if you're going to write a book, not necessarily for publication, but just to write a book. And that was the quickest book I've ever written because it was pure subconscious. But also read something that's nothing to do with your day job, a bit like the concrete example I played you. Read an autobiography every now and again, because that can be very revealing of things that, different people's life paths. I think I told you I'm reading Michelle Obama at the moment. Or to read a magazine or a blog you don't agree with. That can be absolutely fascinating, so that you tend to, when you read a publication you agree with, like a daily paper, you head for the correspondents that you agree with or the columnists. And it can be really quite a comforting experience because you just emerge reading that, feeling that the rest of the world is as agreeable as you are. But actually reading something you don't agree with can be quite challenging. And there's a very lively example of that at the moment with the sort of Harry, Meghan versus the rest of the royal family, that people are taking sides and they're very vitriolic, and just to try and stand back and observe it can be a very interesting thing to do. My final point is, don't wait to sort out your life before starting, which is a very tempting thing to do. It's sort of using life as displacement activity. Displacement activity is the things that you do rather than getting on with what you ought to be doing. And it can be very tempting to do that with writing, that, to tidy your desk or to, I always find the washing up feels quite appealing when I really ought to be getting on with my writing. But don't do that. And the example I'd give you is creativity often thrives when life is troubled. And that was it Lara who mentioned this, that actually tension helps her be creative. And this example is Florence, 15th century Florence under the Medici, which was a time of immense torment. This is the execution of Savonarola, who was a priest who, I don't know if you've heard of the phrase bonfire of the vanities. So he was sort of reacting to the excesses of the Medicis and telling people to throw away their luxuries, and he eventually got burned for his trouble. But there were all sorts of stabbings in the street and political unrest. And yet it's the time of the High Renaissance. It's when Michelangelo and Raphael were painting these amazing images. So you don't feel that creativity only thrives when you've got a perfectly sorted out life. I think it might be the opposite, actually, because my husband has often commented that he thinks he can tell when I'm being really creative, because it's often when I've been most miserable that I've really been very creative. So that brings us to the end of what I wanted to say. I'm going to stop presenting and hope that sparks some thoughts amongst the audience, and there'll be things that you want to say in response, which would be lovely.